being granted to them by their world government. That was Henry Kissinger in an address to the Bilderberg meeting in France. This was back in 1992. And that's going to do it for the first half of our show. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, Aaron Dykes sits down and talks with the author of Fleshing Out Skull and Bones. His name is Chris Milligan, and he will be with Aaron Dykes via video Skype when we come back right after this.
Alex Jones here with a very important announcement for truth seekers. We've carried a lot of amazing films and books over the years on the online video bookstore at INFOWARS.com. And out of all the titles we've carried, one stands out because it is just so chillingly convincing. And that's Dreams from My Real Father by Joel Gilbert, available at INFOWARS.com. This film exposes the fraud that Obama is like nothing I've seen. If you want to know who Obama's real daddy is, this is the film for you. Don't forget, your purchase supports our broadcast and our growing media network. You'll also find at InfoWarsShop.com None Dare Call a Conspiracy by Gary Allen, the book that woke me up. We're also carrying Behind the Green Mask, UN Agenda 21 by Rosa Corey. This book is coffin nails to the globalist takeover. The Greater Good, the most professional and up-to-date film I've ever seen exposing the scourge that is vaccines. These titles and a lot more are all available at InfoWarsShop.com. Sick of the globalist eugenicist control freaks adding poison to your water and laughing as you get sick and die? Start purifying your water with ProPure. My friends, I've done a lot of research, and the best gravity filter out there, bar none, is ProPure, and it's available discounted at InfoWars.com. Its filters are silver impregnated to prevent bacterial growth. There's no priming required. It's NSF 42 certified. Optional fluoride filters can reduce fluoride up to 95%. Easy to set up and use. Doesn't require electricity. Purify water from lakes, streams, ponds, and wells. This filter system leaves in beneficial minerals, which is key. Save money by not buying bottled water and avoid BPA that leaches from the plastic. ProPure is the best gravity-fed filter out there. It's what my family uses. InfoWars.com already has the lowest price on ProPure. But if you add the promo code WATER at checkout, you get an additional 10% off at InfoWars.com. You can also call to order 888-253-3139.
We are back on the InfoWars Nightly News, and we turn now to an interview segment. A real expert on skull and bones, somebody who's really put together a research volume, not only of his work and his research and the things he's privy to, but the research of others, including Anthony Sutton, who's really has been the expert on skull and bones, people like Webster Tarpley, who covered it in their Bush biography, and Charlotte Thompson Iserby, who leaked the list to us, and other important researchers. It's Chris Milligan. He's the publisher of Trine Day, and this book, Fleshing Out Skull and Bones, has really everything in it. So we're glad he's joining us. Chris, thanks very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
So first of all, your father was in the CIA, and this helped you get into the whole area, the whole subject area. Why don't you tell us about your background and your family's background and how you came to find out about the New World Order, skull and bones, and all the related subjects?
Well, my daddy told me, and I didn't believe him. My father got involved in intelligence in the 1930s as an exchange student to the University of Shanghai. And he left Shanghai in 1937, went across the Trans-Siberian Railway, went through Moscow, Berlin, ended up in London at the World Council of Conference Churches with the Dulles brothers. And then as soon as he graduated in 1939, he ended up going directly back to Washington, D.C. He had been scheduled to go to school in Switzerland, but the war came along, and he was soon working in the basement of the Library of Congress under Archibald MacLeish, who was a member of the Order of Skull and Bones and who was a Librarian of Congress and a member of OSS. And my father was in COI, which was Donovan's, Wild Bill Donovan, the gentleman who headed OSS, his first organization, and then he was in OSS. And then in 1943, he got involved in deep politics. They took him out of the basement of the Library of Congress, put him into the military, gave him 2 weeks of training, which was the shortest amount of training you could give somebody, and certify him as being in the military, which was medics training, made him a lieutenant, and also put him in G2, and then put him on MacArthur's staff, because there was people in Washington that didn't quite trust MacArthur and Willoughby, who was his aide. And then he went from, they sent a gentleman over, well, my dad started working with the guerrillas and went into Manila before the troops did, and it was helping the guerrillas set up their diplomatic mission and their government. And in doing that, they put a bunch of the collaborators, the people, the Filipinos who had collaborated with the Japanese, in jail. Well, those happened to be a bunch of MacArthur's friends, because he had been raised in the Philippines. And so when he came back, he found a bunch of his friends in jail, and found out that my father was involved with it. And they said, get rid of my dad. And the person they brought in to get rid of my dad was a gentleman by the name of Edwin Lansdale. And if anybody's looked into what you want to call conspiracy literature, you'll find that Mr. Lansdale is quite prominent in it. And he used to come over to the family house. And then my dad, again, went into the CIA. His last overt job there was branch chief head of all of East Asia Analysis Office. And then he went covert, and ended up in 1956 as a little child, and we were told that my dad was going to East Asia, and he was going to write a book, which had never been written. And then all of a sudden, a couple years after that visit, we moved from Virginia, moved to Tennessee, where my dad became a vice president of a college, and then all of a sudden we moved from Tennessee out to Oregon. And I was just a little kid and didn't really know what was going on. But later on, I found out in the late 60s, my dad asked me what I thought of the Vietnam War. And being raised on John Wayne and World War II, and being a teenager, I gave my dad a flip answer. I said, oh, you had a sack of hand grenades and some rice patties, and you went and threw the hand grenades and won it for the good guys wearing the white hats. And my dad looked at me and said we had to have a talk. And now, I had known my dad had been in intelligence, but it wasn't because he had talked to me, or because my big brother and my big sister, we would talk among ourselves, and it was just something that we knew, but it wasn't something that was talked about at the family table or anything. And he waited for a little while till there was this professor in town, Professor D.F. Fleming from Vanderbilt, and my dad told me it was time to have this talk. And I was about 19, and this was the late 60s. I'd married young. I was married and had a record store and was putting on rock and roll dances. And he took me in my little brother's room and sat me down and started off this conversation. And he looked at me and he said, the Vietnam War is about drugs. And then he said, there's these secret societies behind them. And I'm thinking, okay, my dad's talking about the mafia. And then I'm thinking, okay, and then he says, and communism's all a sham. These same secret societies are behind it all. It's all a big game. And at that point in time, I'm thinking my dad is completely nuts. I mean, I'd been gone to school, and they'd stuffed us underneath desks because the Ruskies were going to bomb us. And it just didn't make any sense to me. And then this little light came on in my head. I figured, well, my dad's having a drug talk with me, because it was the late 60s and I was growing my hair long and smoking a little pot. So I figured my dad's going to, tell me to stop smoking pot. So I kind of up and, and get ready to say, yes, sir. But he doesn't. He continues on telling me about his intelligence career. And I learned quite a bit about, he starts talking to me about they feel that they're playing out a lose scenario in the Vietnam War, and he starts talking to me about psychological warfare and propaganda, and he's telling me the stuff in the newspapers, sway pieces. And again, I'd been a paper boy for I don't know, ever since 7th grade, it didn't make any sense to me. He'd get up in the morning with me, read the paper and everything, and, you know, it just didn't make any sense to me. And pretty soon it became quite apparent that I had no idea what they were talking about. So I just kind of, you know, went on with my life, and again, would talk with my dad now and then, and would have some arguments also. And one thing I learned out of those arguments was that he told me that there was a plan to opiate my whole generation, the whole boomer generation. And it just, again, I didn't quite understand it, but I started to read about, well, I'd always been reading about the Kennedy assassination, but I started reading about CIA drugs and stuff like that. And I would tell people about some stuff that my dad told me, and they'd look at me and they'd say, well, you're a conspiracy theorist. And this was like in the 70s, and I says, well, what's a conspiracy theorist? So I kind of took, you know, started looking at CIA drugs, and then also the subject of conspiracy theory, and kind of took it on as a discipline, and just started researching. And then about 1988, I ran into Anthony Sutton's book, America's Secret Establishment, and that started making some sense to me, what my dad had told me some years before. And my father had, last years of his life, he had cancer and Parkinson's, so I really couldn't talk to him much. But so after he died, I was going through his papers. And at about this time, I was also doing a lot of research in CIA drugs, and was very interested in Chiang Mai, Thailand. And so Chiang Mai, Thailand is basically a heroin city. You know, all the big banks have branches here and everything. And I saw this trip that my dad went on in 1956. He went to Chiang Mai. So I'm thinking, great, I can talk to my mother and ask her, you know, how big was Chiang Mai? Because I'd been told it had been a very small town, and now it's the second largest city in Thailand. And she said, yeah, in 56, it wasn't very big. Biggest thing in town was a church. They had some pictures of it. And so I was pulling down the picture book to look at the pictures. And my mother made this little aside, and she says, and that's when she stopped believing everything she read in the newspapers. And I asked her, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, because when they were in Thailand, the big story was about this big battle in Vietnam, and right where they had been. And she said, there was no battle. We were having a picnic. So I go and turn the picture book back from Chiang Mai, and sure enough, there's Colonel Lansdale and my dad, and some people with fatigues on, you know, and berets and stuff, and they're having a picnic. And there's this beautiful picture of my mother, which ended up being used in her memorial. And it says out from the side, it says Eudora, that was her name, Eudora out from Saigon with Colonel Lansdale and North Vietnamese military leaders. Mm-hmm. Okay? And so what my dad said was absolutely true about the Vietnam War being about drugs. And they took American boys and girls and sent them to hell for 1 year. Okay? And those boys and girls knew that after 1 year, they got to go home. Well, some of those boys and girls got addicted to the heroin that was being proffered to them by all kinds of people over there. And then you have, you know, heroin addicts that they get sent back, and what do? They start selling heroin. Okay? And so, I mean, this kind of demonstrates the perfidy of what's going on, what goes on with as our foreign policy, and the psychological games. Because, see, one, you know, you can go into books, conspiracy theory books, and you can, people will say, well, the FBI, you know,